The committee will come to order. Yesterday we approved 4 bills, and today we'll continue our consideration of the remaining 7 bills scheduled for this markup. Our first order of business this morning is H.R. 6199 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to include certain over-the-counter medical products as qualified medical expenses. I now recognize and yield to the gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Jenkins, the sponsor, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For several years, Congressman Kind and I have been working on legislation to restore Americans' access to over-the-counter medicines using their HSA and FSA accounts. On this current version of the Restoring Access to Medication Act, I'm pleased to also be joined by bipartisan introduction with Congressman Eric Paulson and Congresswoman Grace Ming. Since 2002, millions of Americans each year have used their flexible spending arrangements and health savings accounts and other similar tax-preferred health accounts to help reduce their health care spending. However, this changed with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Consumers are now required to obtain a prescription for over-the-counter medications in order to be eligible for reimbursement under these accounts. This change, which went into effect January 1st, 2011, severely limits the ability of millions of American families to use funds set aside in their FSAs and HSAs to purchase over-the-counter products, such as those for pain management, smoking cessation, and cold and allergy medications. According to an April 2014 study by Nielsen, 75% of Americans support changing the law to grant over-the-counter medications tax preference once again. Over-the-counter medications are often the frontline treatment for many common illnesses or for maintenance of chronic diseases and should be treated as medically reimbursable healthcare therapies, just as prescription medications are. One study conducted found that over-the-counter medicines save the United States healthcare system $102 billion every year through cost savings associated with these medicines and avoided visits to the doctor. Restricting consumers' ability to be reimbursed under FSAs and other tax-preferred accounts imposes an unfair cost increase on individuals and families at a time when many still struggle financially. The Health Choices Coalition, representing physicians, dentists, consumers, retailers, manufacturers, pharmacies, pharmacists, patients, insurers, small businesses, and large employers are all in support of restoration of this benefit on behalf of millions of Americans. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 6199, which will restore these critical over-the-counter consumer benefits. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kine, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank Ms. Jenkins for her partnership, her leadership on this issue, along with our colleague Eric Paulson on committee and Grace Meng, who have joined on this legislation. This legislation, Mr. Chairman, is a classic example that we did not get everything right with passage of the Affordable Care Act. It's an example of fixing, not ending, what was attempting to try to bring quality, affordable health care to all Americans. Ms. Jenkins, I think, laid out the purpose, the policy behind this legislation. It doesn't make sense to have people with HSA and FSA accounts to have to run to their doctor first, with the inefficiency and the waste of time and the expense of getting a prescription from them over basic over-the-counter medicine that, as Ms. Jenkins points out, could save over $102 billion every year within the healthcare system. Medication that can be used for pain management, smoking cessation, cold allergy medications, even feminine hygiene would be covered under this. And it's an important, I think, step in trying to get the policy right. And I'll ask Mr. Barthold in a little bit, too, as far as the scoring. This does come with a $6.7 billion 10-year score, and I'm curious whether there's cost savings involved by not requiring patients to have to go to their doc first to get a script before getting over the counter, and whether that's calculated at all in the score. So I'm kind of foreshadowing, Mr. Barthold, the question that I'm going to be bringing with you. But I've had conversations, Mr. Chairman, with Chairman Brady about the need for this committee to do a better job as far as being fiscally responsible in the legislation that we're offering and trying to find some offsets in a bipartisan, reasonable way to help pay for this. $6.7 billion, that's not peanuts, it's over 10 years. This committee, I feel, especially has a responsibility of keeping an eye on our fiscal ledger, more so than the appropriators who like to spend money. Commerce obviously doesn't have control over what's spent or what's raised. This committee has the responsibility of raising the revenue to fund our government operations. And I would also submit, as many experts do, that through the tax expenditures, we spend a lot of money too, as a committee. So we especially have a responsibility to try to be working in a more fiscally responsible manner. And I know many of our colleagues are troubled by the accumulating deficits now. We're almost in the era of annual $1 trillion budget deficits with no end in sight. And I'm afraid that when the sugar high wears off with this tax cut that was passed late last year, we're not going to have many fiscal tools available in order to counteract a recession or perhaps something even worse. And all that burden then would fall back on the Federal Reserve to try to stabilize our economy. So I will continue to work with my colleagues across the aisle before floor action. I know that the rules of the committee don't require offsets to be identified during committee markup. I think this is sensible policy that we ought to be looking at and trying to pursue. But I would also hope that we can continue conversations before this comes up on the floor to find some reasonable bipartisan offsets to pay for this legislation. And with that, I encourage support for the bill and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kind. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6199. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. And without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. We'll now turn to Tom Barthold, Staff Director of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask the members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 51 and 52, which describe H.R. 6199 and the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute. As Ms. Jenkins and Mr. Kind had noted, this legislation's been before the committee before. Members, I believe, are familiar with it. I'll just emphasize that the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute, in addition to providing the short title for the legislation, makes clear that the effective date is that these changes that would provide that over-the-counter drugs, feminine care products, are qualifying medical expenses for purposes of FSAs, HRAs, HSAs, and Archer MSAs. that the change is effective for expenses incurred by the taxpayer for the purchase of these items after December 31st of this year. That concludes my brief explanation. Happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you, Mr. Bartold. Are there any questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up, Mr. Barth, there is a $6.7 billion 10-year score that's attached. I presume that number is coming from additional contributions that people are going to be making in order to cover the expense of these OTC medications?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Kind.
Yeah. This legislation, however, doesn't call for expanding HSAs or the amount of money being contributed. This is just a mere allowable use of money that would normally go into HSA accounts.
HSAs and health flexible spending accounts are the primary sources, yes, sir.
Now, was it taken into consideration, to your knowledge, the savings that we may realize by not forcing patients to have to first go to their treating physician in order to get a prescription for this OTC medication?
Can I give you a slightly nuanced answer? The effect of permitting these expenses to qualify for the tax-preferred accounts is to moderately change the price of acquisition of the accounts. So the basic economics of it is that there's a small price change. Do not expect the small price change to either foreclose people from, under present law, from purchasing these items or from changing dramatically their purchases in the future. So the effect in terms of increased use of these products and the long-term cost savings that Ms. Jenkins noted would be fairly modest and is not direct, and that small account effect is not directly taken into account, in part because it's modest and in part because it's some of it is longer term over the outside.
But just to be clear, that if a patient now with the FSA or HSA account has to go to the doctor to get a script to get OTC medication, there is a billable charge for them doing that, is there not?
Oh, agree. The point I was making was that the change is not saying someone can purchase something that they couldn't purchase before.
Right.
The effect of this is to say when you purchase it, it effectively is a little bit cheaper.
Okay, but I'm understanding from you that the fact that we are saving some money by not requiring patients to have to go to the doctor and spending money for
Do not account
that's
for the
accounted
transportation
score.
costs, the time costs.
Nor
That's correct,
is
sir.
the overall medical health care savings of $1.2 billion a year or so that Ms. Jenkins cited, that does not factor in.
Well, that was the nuanced point I was trying to make, in that the change in use of these products is fairly modest because the price change is fairly modest.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a document from the Joint Tax Committee confirming that more than 80% of the tax benefit of HSAs goes to individuals earning $100,000 or more.
Without objection, so ordered. Any other questions in the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Seeing none, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. A roll call has been requested. We'll get to that. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 6199 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorable reporting the bill H.R. 6199 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6199 is, as amended, is favorably reported to the House. Roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Roscom?
Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, aye. Mr. Crowley? Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Sanchez? Chairman Brady? The gentleman is not recorded. Yes. Mr. Curbelo, yes.
Clerk will report.
24 yeas, 10 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 24 and the noes are 10. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6199, as amended, is favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 6312, the Personal Health Investment Today Act. I'll turn to Mr. Smith of Missouri, original sponsor of the bill, for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for allowing this markup on this legislation. I also want to thank Representative Kine for the work that we've been trying to move this forward and getting this legislation passed. This bill is about a couple things. First, it's about a fundamental shift to our approach to health care to focus on healthy living. Under the FIT Act, we finally create an incentive for people to invest in themselves to improve their health. We finally focus on preventative medicine to address health problems that can be created by unhealthy lifestyles. Second, it's about improving the health of our children. According to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, parents who are inactive are 5.8 times more likely to have inactive children. And according to the Department of Defense, approximately 1 in 4 people aged 17 to 24 in the United States is too overweight to serve in the military. This bill will help our children get active by allowing people to use tax-preferred accounts to cover the cost of their children's school sports programs. Lastly, this is about so many Americans who are battling obesity and improving their health in order to spend less on health care by losing weight. I thank the chairman for bringing up the FIT Act, and I urge all the members of the committee to join me in supporting healthy living. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now turn to Mr. Kine, original co-sponsor of the bill, for purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Mr. Smith, too, for his partnership, his leadership, the work that we've been doing on the FIT Act over a number of years. Mr. Chairman, the policy behind this is real simple. It's to try to create some incentives up front in the tax code to help people, and especially children, to be more physically active in their lives, to make the healthy choice the easy choice for it. And by that, part of this means making it more financially feasible for people to get up and participate in physical activity, because we know now that we're spending close to $200 billion a year in treating obesity-related illness and disease in our country. There's so much backload in the tax code dealing with health complications, usually later in life, especially the tax exclusion that we have on employer-based health plans, when there ought to be more of a focus and more concentration on the upfront, on prevention, and helping people lead healthier lifestyle. And this is especially true for the children of our country, where we know that that's where the true battleground lies as far as changing the culture to help people lead healthier lives. Yet we're hearing more accounts, more evidence coming in that more children are being withheld from organized team sports or other physical activities because of the cost of these activities or equipment. There were some last-minute changes made to the legislation, in part to reduce the cost. Right now we're looking at a $3.5 billion 10-year cost to it that will exclude athletic equipment. We've agreed to continue conversations to see, at the very least, that we try to cover that athletic equipment that children need in order to participate, and hopefully we'll be able to reach some landing ground before floor action on it. That inevitably will increase the cost of this bill, but I think it's important that we work through this and make sure that we're not leaving children behind just because of their own socioeconomic circumstances. So the intent is clear. Let's try to do a little upfront investment through the tax code, try to get people to be more physically active in their life. The back-end savings could potentially reap tens of billions of dollars by reducing the obesity rate trend lines that we're seeing in our country. Policy-wise, this makes sense, but hopefully, fiscally, we can also continue to talk about finding some reasonable bipartisan offsets to help pay for this. With that, I encourage adoption of this legislation and yield back.
Thank you. We'll now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6312. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. And this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purposes of the amendment. We'll now turn to Tom Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 47 and 48, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute. Under present law, qualifying medical expenses can include physical therapy as prescribed for treatment for diseases by a physician, but do not, as a general matter, include expenses incurred in a regimen of physical exercise. The proposal before you would expand qualified medical expenses to include amounts paid for memberships at fitness facilities, participation and instruction in a program of physical exercise, physical activity, and certain safety equipment that may be for use in such programs. These amounts are limited to $500 per year for a single individual, $1,000 in the case of a joint or head of household return, and no more than $250 may be spent on the qualifying safety equipment. The proposal would be effective for taxable years beginning after December 31st, 2018, and that concludes my description of the proposal. I'll be happy to answer any questions that the members might have.
Thank you. Are there any questions of Mr. Barthold about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Is anyone listening at all? No. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a sub? Oh, Mr. Kelly, welcome. Back to you in the booth. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized. Thanks be to God.
No, I was not asleep. After a great morning workout, and I do want to strongly endorse this because I think there's one thing, in addition to the case that Mr. Smith and Mr. Kind have produced, we also know that the greatest advantage right now of physical fitness and physical activity is also that it produces an effect that some people turn to synthetic drugs now to try and get. So whenever you have the ability to produce dopamine through endorphins, and that is all because of working out and physical activity, that's proven. And I think that right now, for what we're looking at in the country with this opioid crisis that we have, there's no better way to address this and future health care costs and people's physical well-being than looking at pieces like this that encourage that type of activity. We can go all the way back to President Kennedy, by the way, who really was endorsing this at a very early age and telling people, get out, get moving, do things to make yourself, get yourself in shape. So in addition to nutrition and physical activity, there's no better way to address health concerns and have a healthier nation than what we're trying to do with this. So, Mr. Kind, thank you for your work in this. Mr. Smith, thank you so much for your work in this. And thank you for everybody that's awake and listening to what we're trying to do today. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Kind.
I move to strike the last word.
Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate your comments, Mr. Kelly, because you're right on point. You know, when Zach Wamp, our former colleague, was a member, he and I teamed up on another fit bill that tried to expand PE curriculum in our schools, and that on a voluntary basis. And we had from time to time Richard Simmons come up to testify before the committee, and he was fond of saying that one of the greatest antidepressants ever invented is good old-fashioned sweat. Just having people get out and physically active, and the endorphins that you talked about. And in light of the opioid epidemic, the pain management problems that we have throughout our country right now, this is another piece of trying to fill that puzzle and trying to find solutions for people. And what I think is a pretty inexpensive way of doing it too, just making it more financially feasible for people to be able to get involved, more physically active in sports clubs, health fitness clubs, but especially targeting the youth of our country. And it's unfortunate seeing a child having to stand on the sideline just because their parents or that family can't afford certain athletic equipment for them. So hopefully that's something else that we're going to be able to work on as we move forward. But a very valid point, and I appreciate your comments, Mr. Kelly. I yield back.
Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 6312 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 6312 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 6312 as amended is favorably reported to the House. A roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed?
Aye.
Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Ms. Nome, aye. Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Ms. Schweikert? Or Mr. Schweikert? Sorry. Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, aye. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, yes. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, aye. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Black? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Sanchez? Chairman Brady?
Mr. Pascrell is recognized. Clerk?
Mr. Pascrell changes to yes.
How is Mr. Nunes recorded?
Mr. Nunes is recorded as yes.
Clerk will report.
28 yeas and 7 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 28, the noes are 7. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 6312, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. And without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is H.R. 4616 to amend the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act to provide for a temporary moratorium on the employer mandate and to provide for a delay in the implementation of the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage. Now turn to Mr. Kelly of Pennsylvania. Mr. Nunes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Roscom and Ranking Member Neal, for scheduling this markup and considering H.R. 4616, the Employer Relief Act of 2018. This bill will provide much-needed retroactive relief from the employer mandate enacted under Obamacare, as well as delay the Cadillac tax for 1 additional year. Delaying the Cadillac tax, which forces employers to pay 40% tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage, will provide much-needed relief not only to employers but to the employees forced to bear the repercussions of this tax. This bill will also provide relief from other harmful policy enacted under Obamacare, the employer mandate. The employer mandate unfairly forces businesses with 50 or more full-time employees to offer insurance coverage and levies significant penalties on businesses that fail to comply. This mandate stifles businesses that are already being burdened by overregulation on all fronts. The recent retroactive enforcement of this mandate imposes unanticipated costs on employers due to a lack of appropriate notification by the Obama administration. This bill will protect the hardworking business owners and employees like those in the San Joaquin Valley of California by providing retroactive relief from Obamacare's employer mandate that is being wrongly enforced 3 years later. Given the recent repeal of the individual mandate, this legislation continues to provide relief to hardworking Americans and gets us 1 step closer to repeal of the employer mandate. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for considering this legislation, and I yield back.
We'll now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 4616, and without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. At this time, I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it, and without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for the purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Mr. Tom Barthold to provide a technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction, and I ask that members defer their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, you have before you two joint committee documents, JCX 61 and 62, which describe the underlying legislation and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. The underlying legislation provides that the assessable payment, the employer mandate, does not apply to any month in the calendar years 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018. In addition, the clarification of the chairman's amendment in the nature of the substitute provides that the present law moratorium on the high-cost excise tax on employer-sponsored health coverage is extended for one additional year through calendar year 2022. That concludes my brief description. Be happy to answer any questions that the members
Thank you,
might have.
Mr. Barthold. Are there any questions of Mr. Barthold about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Levin.
I guess your explanation was very brief, appropriately. We're going through the motions here. None of this is going to happen. It would never pass the Senate, even if you decided to bring it up to the House with this kind of a score. So I just want to ask Mr. Barthold, so it's clear. So this applies retroactive relief for the years, so-called relief, for the years 2015 through 2018, costing how much?
The moratorium on the employer mandate we've estimated to have a budgetary effect of a loss of $25.9 billion, sir.
And so we would rebate to employers what they've already paid?
In the case, collection is underway for prior years, as the committee's aware. Sometimes business tax collections lag behind as the Internal Revenue Service reconciles tax liabilities with what was paid. But the short answer to your question is yes, for years 2015, 2016, and in some cases 2017, amounts may already have been paid and those would be rebated.
Do we have any idea who
there's
these...
current collection action happening for tax years in some 2016, some 2017, 2018. So the amounts represented on the table are not purely, are not complete rebates. As you can see, the fiscal year effects, some of the fiscal year effects are payments in the future, but it's related to collection enforcement activity that's occurring presently.
And do we have any idea who these people are?
I don't have names. I mean, yes, it's known. It's information that could be had. It would also be, just as a reminder for the committee, it'd be return information that's protected under the confidentiality rules. You know, specific names.
Can you think of other instances where we've provided retroactive relief for 3-4 years of tax payments?
There have been limited circumstances that have grown out of policy changes. A couple of simple cases that I can think of have been as a result of court decisions. The Congress has repealed or provided for retroactive repayment of taxes paid, for example, in the export tax on coal, and when part of the telephone excise tax was overturned by the courts. And
That's where
both involved multiple year rebates of prior taxes collected.
that's where there were court decisions.
Those two particular examples were kind of the quick ones off the top of my head.
And where there is a challenge to those payments for the years for which there was a repayment, right?
The specific court cases were challenging the constitutionality. In the case of coal, it was the constitutionality of a tax on exports.
Right, and so the years that were rebated were the years that were in contention in the court case.
That's correct, sir.
I mean, this is kind of unbelievable. I guess this is an election year, and so some people here think we should essentially provide a return of monies that were there. There was no there was no court case here that said that these payments were unconstitutional, right?
No, sir, I was not suggesting there was a court case involved. That was just an example of prior rebates that the Congress has provided for.
So essentially, we're handing out.
Time has expired.
We're handing out checks. Thank you.
Are there any other questions of Mr. Bartold about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthol, I wanted to ask you a question about how you scored this legislation. Before the IRS can assess a penalty tax, an employer must receive a notice that one of their employees received a premium subsidy under the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act explicitly requires the ACA exchanges send this notice. However, in 2015 and in 2017, the exchanges failed to send a notice to employers. Because employers did not receive these notices, did the Joint Committee on Taxation take this violation into effect when developing the score for H.R. 4616?
Allow me to double check and get back to you on that. But as a general matter, what we checked on this is assessments made by the IRS. Pardon me for just a second, Mr.
Yes.
I will double check, but our base on this was assessments that have been made by the IRS, collection activity that has been undertaken by the IRS.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit this letter from organizations that represent a broad coalition of employers who've been hurt by the employer mandate. It's clear that employers' due process rights have been violated because of the failure to follow the law. This justifies why relief from the employer mandate penalty should be provided now so Republicans can work with Democrats who support eliminating the employer mandate to fully repeal this tax in future legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I yield back.
Are there other questions about the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Does anyone wish to strike the last word? Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I travel the 14 counties of my district, I hear a lot of concerns about health care. There's the rural hospital administrator who's struggling to keep the doors of the only hospital in the county open, who sometimes pays her staff out of her own pocket. There's the middle-aged daughters and sons across my district who have had to leave their jobs to take care of their parents because they can't afford home health care. There are countless working families who are facing enormous premium costs because the state of Alabama did not expand Medicaid and they have no assistance. There are many senior citizens that call my office in desperate need of a ride to the pharmacy to get their insulin or to the doctor's office because they're sick and in need of primary care. But as I go across my district and talk about health care, I have not heard from my constituents that there needs to be any reform to the health savings account. As I said in our last hearing on health savings accounts last month, I see the value of health savings accounts as a financial tool for the privileged. But to be honest, outside of Washington, I haven't heard from my constituents requesting that we raise the contribution level on their health savings account or allow them to use their health saving account for memberships at local fitness centers. You know, I voted in favor of some of these bills that we've been considering over the last 2 days, and I have been co-sponsors of other versions. But let's be clear, all of these bills need bipartisan offsets. I see the value of some of these bills, but I do not believe that the benefits are strong enough to justify the unpaid costs associated with them. I've been thinking a lot this week about the $92 billion worth of costs of the 11 bills that we're considering total. And in fact, this bill, H.R. 4616, would cost $39.5 billion. That's $39.5 billion with no offset. I'm really baffled by the fact that my colleagues across the aisle have always considered themselves to be fiscal responsibility as their hallmark. But yesterday and today, we've been debating bills that cost $92 billion over 10 years with no pay for. And as many of my colleagues have mentioned, we all know what comes next. There will come a day when we realize that the tax cut bill that we passed earlier this year, as well as these bills that are not paid for, will make us have to take tough decisions when it comes to Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and other really important lifeline programs for the folks that I represent. Mr. Chairman, these 11 bills we're considering cost $92 billion. And I'm going to take a moment to explain to my constituents what we could do with $92 billion if we had $92 billion. For $92 billion, we could increase the NIH's budget by almost 250% this year alone. Or we could add $9 billion to its budget every year for the next 10 years. For $92 billion, we could finance 3 million doses of the generic drugs that would solve and be life-saving for those folks who have opioid. Or we could pay for a 30-day rehab for 3.6 million Americans struggling with addiction on the opioid crisis. For $92 billion, we could purchase 736,000 new ambulances for rural hospitals and clinics throughout this nation. Or we could also help our rural hospitals finance the cost of their medical staff. For $92 billion, we could hire 657,000 nurses and 221,000 physicians. 85 rural hospitals have closed since 2010. Each of those municipalities that have lost a hospital could provide with over $1 billion to rebuild those hospitals, build clinics, and recruit medical professionals. Each of the 5,500 registered hospitals in the country could receive $16 million in funding to expand their services, to train more doctors, or to buy new equipment or ambulances with this funding. Instead of making an already lucrative tax shelter stronger for those most privileged in this country, we could literally give every single homeless veteran in this country 2.4 million homes. I ask you, Mr. Chairman, we should really consider why we're debating health savings accounts and other bills that would cost in excess of $92 billion. And instead, I would say that we could decide to use those resources to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Reed, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I speak in strong support for the legislation here before us in regards to putting in place a relief for those small and mid-sized businesses that are represented by this temporary relief. I actually support the complete repeal of this mandate. And if we're on this side of the aisle going to have to stand with the mom-and-pop shops as our colleagues on the other side of the aisle may be voting against this legislation, I'll gladly stand with those mom-and-pop shops. These are small businesses of America that we're hearing the voice of here today. These are the folks that are working hard day in and day out to cover their payrolls, to make the investments, to grow their businesses, and to provide job opportunities for not only the present generation, but the next generation. And as we see the mandates continue to impact those individuals in a deeply negative way, as health care costs continue to go up under existing policies, I think it's only fair, as we relieve the burden for the individuals from a mandate penalty, that we stand with those small and mid-sized companies and hear their voice and give them the relief that they so need during these difficult times in healthcare. Mr. Chairman, I would also add that the Problem Solvers Caucus, which I am the proud Republican chair of, put together a proposal that gave relief to stabilize the individual marketplace. And in those bipartisan conversations, one of the pieces of the agreement was that we would move the employer mandate from 50 to 500 employees. I know that's different than what we're talking about in the present legislation, but I would offer, Mr. Chairman, that we were able to find common ground to at least rationalize the federal policy by moving the employer mandate from 50 to 500, which is defined in other areas of the federal code as the true definition of a small and middle-sized company in America. To put a mandate on mom-and-pop shops of 50 employees or more really is hitting the heart of America's economic engine, and that is small business America that we have seen over the years just so blossom and grow the economic might of our local communities, especially those communities of rural communities across the country. So I would implore my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, stand with us, hear the voice of those mom-and-pop shops, and give them the fair relief that we're trying to do here with the present legislation. And let's set aside the partisan bickering. Let's set aside the partisan divide of healthcare today and come together and solve this problem once and for all, in my opinion, for that voice of small and mid-sized companies across America. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Kelly, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, H.R. 4616 delays the Cadillac tax for one additional year until 2023. We've discussed the Cadillac tax at length in this committee and how it is a misguided policy in the Affordable Care Act. In fact, this is an issue that unites both Republicans and Democrats. My bill to permanently repeal the entire Cadillac tax, H.R. 173, is close to 300 co-sponsors and already has a veto-proof majority of Republicans and Democrats. This bill's great progress, but we can't lose sight of the goal, the full repeal of the Cadillac tax. This tax continues to hang over the head of 175 million Americans who receive health care insurance through their employer. I'm also pleased that we're giving relief to employers crushed under the employer mandate, another misguided policy in the Affordable Care Act that the Obama administration, by the way, never enforced. First, small employers with just over 50 employees continue to spend millions of dollars on administrative compliance and reporting for a penalty tax that was never enforced by the Obama administration. Second, this is something that people across the spectrum support repealing. For example, the left-leaning Urban Institute supports repealing the employer mandate. From their report, this is hardly a right-wing paper, our analysis, as well as that of others, find that eliminating the employer mandate will not reduce insurance coverage significantly, contrary to its supporters' expectations. And eliminating it will remove labor market distortions that have troubled employer groups and which would harm some workers. Listen, I think that when we talk about this is something that never should have ever been. I keep hearing, well, this is never going to go anywhere. Well, you know what? It never should have been implemented. It never should have been part of a law. And I think that once all this excitement over somehow getting this Affordable Care Act pushed through, people started to look at, well, who was going to pay for it and how are we going to penalize people? And I got to tell you, as one of those private companies, when you start paying $600,000 a year for insurance coverage, and you can only keep it that low by making sure that deductibles and co-pays are so high, there's so many people walking around this country right now with an insurance card but no coverage. This was a misguided position to begin with. Cadillac tax repeal should be made permanent, and I would hope that both sides, and we both agree on this, by the way, that this should be repealed. So I don't want this to be a partisan issue today that somehow we can't do this because it's coming up under the leadership of the Republican Party right now. This is something that just makes sense for America. And when you look at the numbers, Mr. Chairman, 175 million Americans receive their health care through their employer. Why would we penalize these people for doing the right thing for the people that they work with every day? Why would we tell them that this Cadillac tax, this health care package that you have today, and in America we're telling people, well, gosh, your employer is providing you with something that's just too generous for you. When did we ever reach that point where we said to our fellow citizens, this is too generous? You need to tone it down a little bit. You need to have a reduced coverage. You don't deserve to have the coverage that you have fought for all your life. And I got to tell you, my friends in labor, this has been a generational fight, a generational concern to have health care coverage. And this is something they've won over the years. What a slap in the face to our blue-collar friends to tell them right now, you know what, you've got it, but it's too damn generous. You don't deserve it. Listen, the repeal of the Cadillac tax is not just something we need to do, it's something that's necessary and will restore Americans' faith in what it is that we're doing in the House of Representatives to help them. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Levin is recognized to strike the last word.
Well, we're going through the motions here, and essentially you're putting up a bill that you think will help some of you be reelected. That's what this is really all about. You know it will not pass the Senate. You didn't repeal the employer mandate. You did not do that. It would have cost $225 billion. So instead, you're trying to do it piecemeal, and you won't do it. So you'll be able to go back home and say you're providing retroactive relief for a number of years. How much, Mr. Bartholt, would this cost? This part, not the Cadillac tax, just so we understand it. How much?
The moratorium on the employer mandate, we estimated, is a loss of $25.9 billion, Mr. Levin.
Okay. So you didn't repeal the employer mandate. I think we would have opposed it dramatically, but it cost too much. So essentially, you want to take a piece of it so people can go home and say, look what I've done. When you haven't done it, it won't happen.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
If this is such a great piece in the Affordable Care Act, why didn't the Obama administration enforce it?
It is now being enforced.
Oh, and it's now being enforced.
Yeah,
I see. So whenever it was
took
written,
a while.
No, it was part. And I got to tell you, sir.
Okay,
this was wrong-headed from the beginning.
I take back my time.
Thank you.
Your company may benefit from this, sir. Your company may benefit from this. And a number of you may benefit politically. This is not the way to do health care policy.
I would caution the gentleman to regarding questioning the motives of members.
I didn't question the motive.
I would caution the gentleman. The gentleman
I don't need
controls
to
the
be
time.
cautioned. I didn't question the motivation. What I'm doing is pointing out the reality of what the speaker just said himself about his company. I didn't talk about motivation, sir.
Time's a wasting.
No, it isn't. I think we should understand what's going on here. This committee should be having hearings on health care. That's what we should be doing here. And we should not be introducing bills that have some political potential impact. I think that undermines the credibility of this committee. And I go back far enough, and Mr. Neal does, and Mr. Lewis does, and others, Mr. Doggett, my colleague from California, from Connecticut, and other places, when this committee would never have dreamed of doing this. Never. It undermines our credibility as a committee that is dedicated to looking at public policy and struggling to implement good public policy, not to become an instrument of politics of the moment. So bring this up on the floor if you want, and you'll hear our reaction. I yield back.
Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 4616 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 4616 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 4616 as amended is favorably reported to the House. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbello? Mr. Curbello, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrip? Dr. Winstrip, aye. Mr. Neal?
No.
Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Nome? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Sanchez? Chairman Brady.
Are you recorded?
How am I reported?
The gentleman is not recorded.
I would like to be recorded as a no.
Mr. Crowley, no. The chairman is not recorded. Chairman Brady, aye.
The clerk will report.
22 yeas, 15 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 22, the noes are 15. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 4616, as amended, is favorably reported to the House of Representatives. And without objection, I ask that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and that members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. The Eagle has landed.
Our next order of business is H.R. 6306 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to increase the contribution limit for health savings accounts and for other purposes. And now turn to Mr. Paulson to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've had a lot of discussion and debate over the years and on the last few days about how to broaden access to high-quality health care. And reducing the cost of medical care itself is one of the most effective ways to increase access to quality care by lowering premiums and improving health care outcomes. And this is where health care savings accounts can help and have been shown to help. They're particularly effective at putting pressure downward on prices. And research has shown that families and individuals and those who have HSAs, they spend less health care, they use fewer medical services, all at the same time while keeping primary and preventative care initiatives for themselves. According to one estimate, if half of employer health plans incorporated HSAs, national savings and health care spending would drop about $57 billion annually. Another study showed that people using an HSA spent 15% less than those who did not have an HSA. So the bill we have today, H.R. 6306, improves the rules around health care savings accounts in three ways. First, it increases the contribution limits for HSAs. The average Obamacare deductible right now for a bronze plan is more than $6,000, with an average out-of-pocket cost closer to $7,000. And we know HSAs allow folks to save money to pay for some of those out-of-pocket costs, but people can only put aside $3,450 according to the IRS rules right now. So this bill would allow people to contribute more up to their out-of-pocket maximums. Secondly, the bill would improve HSA rules by allowing those age 55 and older to make catch-up contributions even when their spouses also contribute to an HSA account. And then third and finally, we know that HSAs, since they've been first established, they've become more popular. We already know that 22 million Americans and over 1 million Minnesotans use an HSA account and eligible for those plans. It also means that new users probably have some medical expenses that they've had to pay for out of pocket before formally establishing their HSA account. And currently they can't use that new HSA money to pay for those services that were set up or used before the establishment of the account. So this bill will also allow people to pay medical bills with a grace period of 60 days for medical expenses incurred before the formal establishment of an HSA. The bottom line is we're improving the rules for HSA account holders to allow them to contribute more, to make catch-up contributions with their spouse, and then pay older medical bills out of an HSA account, improvements that make sense. And I would ask my colleagues to support the initiative, and I yield back.
Thank you. We will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 6306. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. This time, I offer an amendment in nature substitute, which was distributed in advance along with the green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in nature substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Tom Barthold, Staff Director for the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in nature of a substitute with an emphasis on the changes made since introduction. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Dr. Barthold, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members have before them two joint committee documents, JCX 53 and 54, which describe H.R. 6306 and the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. This proposal has three components. As a reminder, health savings accounts, for a taxpayer to be eligible to establish a health savings account, the taxpayer must have a qualifying high-deductible health plan. Under present law, as Mr. Paulson noted, the limit on contributions to a health savings account are $3,450 in the case of a self-only coverage, $6,900 in the case of family coverage, with $1,000 catch-up contributions allowed for taxpayers age 55 or older. The first provision of the legislation would increase the contribution amounts to equal the sum of the minimum annual deductible amount of a qualifying high-deductible health plan and plus the allowable out-of-pocket expenditures to be a qualifying high-deductible health plan. For 2018, that would have the effect of increasing the maximum HSA contribution for self-only coverage to $6,650 and for family coverage to $13,300. The $1,000 catch-up amount would remain unchanged. These numbers, by the way, are indexed for inflation. In two other more modest changes, under present law, if both taxpayers of joint filers are eligible to have an HSA, basic contributions may be allocated between the spouses. You're not permitted to have a joint HSA, but you may allocate your contributions to the other spouse if that's beneficial to the household. The proposal of the legislation would permit both spouses to also allocate catch-up contributions if they so chose. And then, as noted by Mr. Paulson, often a taxpayer may not establish the HSA until after they have signed up for coverage under a high-deductible health plan. The legislation would permit a 60-day grace period from the commencement of coverage under the high-deductible health plan in which qualifying medical expenses would be qualified